It's been almost 62 years since those shots rang out in Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd, 1963. I was the ripe old age of 2 when it happened. Not old enough to understand the significance of it, at least at that moment. Yet, like so many Americans, I have grown up with the tragedy that never seems to leave us. And I still struggle with the mystery of what really happened and why. I have come to understand the tragic role that this event played in the current history of our country. So much suffering that followed, and all brought about by this singular, brutal, and wretched event that occurred in Dallas. They say that those who do not know history are bound to repeat it. So, missing out on the lessons of history will surely doom one to the mistakes of those who went before. Most all of the witnesses are gone now in this murder case, save just a few, and the event, as the perpetrators planned it, is slowly sinking to the bottom of our psyche, like the Titanic, making its way to the bottom of the ocean. Time does that, and 62 years of it have taken their toll on our ability to get at the truth of it all. Over the years, people would ask me, what is the relevance of the assassination now? Isn't it simply a tragic event of history? Well, yes, of course, I would respond, but it really is so much more. Remember, those that do not know history are bound to repeat it. But just when I strained to put the universe of this case into a thimble of words that might resonate to someone, the modern world has once again so graciously elevated the significance of this assassination. In 1963, it was almost unheard of to a common citizen amongst us that the government would lie to them, deliberately deceive the public. And if, in the rarest of occasions, they weren't telling us the entire story, well, it absolutely must have been for our own good, and for good reason. We believe that as a nation of free people. But you see, the assassination of JFK and what happened in its aftermath shattered all of that. Today, there is great skepticism. What was unthinkable to the public in 1963 is, well, almost expected in 2025. The world has grown up a bit in 62 years, hasn't it? The naivete is less now and the skepticism is higher. Cell phones that capture the truth make an analysis of the Zapruder film seem, well, almost ancient. Just as JFK trumpeted these words, I will too. A new generation of Americans, as he would proudly say. Well, this time, this new generation of Americans is, again, asking for the truth in this case. The truth the 2 major government investigations failed to truly solve. But now, a wave of political discourse has swept across this country and paved the way, once again, for an attempt at learning more about the truth of the assassination of our president, and learning more about what secrets the government has been keeping for all this time, all 62 years, secrets that they are still clutching to for some seemingly unknown reason. Was it a coup, really, of our government, or just a cover-up to save 40 million lives from perishing in a nuclear war, as Lyndon Johnson would have us believe? Oh, how we all hope it wasn't a coup. But those of us who have studied this case would tell you that it might very well have been just that. And then, in the aftermath, a perpetual cycle of obfuscation about the truth of it all. I understand. Who would admit to such a horrible thing? Even today, when most men and women in the government weren't even born when these events occurred. Still, it's like protecting a family secret. As if that crazy great uncle of yours who's been dead for years is going to keep you from getting into Harvard because he robbed a bank. Isn't it ironic that the CIA itself chronicled its own secrets for a while and memorialized them in a document called The Family Jewels? How poetically fitting for this story. Congressman Anna Paulina Luna's official title is Chairwoman of the Task Force on the Declassification of Federal Secrets. She is a congresswoman from the great state of Florida, where I hail from. The task force she heads is her baby, and she represents that new generation of Americans who want to get at the truth. And they know that this little piece of history regarding the assassination is where things really started to go wrong in this country, in our modern era. She joined the Air Force at age 19. She's 36 now. She had and has the grit to begin this new run at the truth. I hope we can all help to make her successful and one more time really attempt to settle this thing for all of us. Now, where it leads beyond just being truthful about government documents and making them available to us, well, that still hangs in the balance. But as a student of the assassination case for the last 30 years, one thing I do know is that there are still a handful of men and women on this earth that know more than anyone else about the case. That is true, even though many of the original investigators are gone now. There are no Harold Weisbergs or Penn Jones left in the mix. They are all gone. The men and the women who interviewed the witnesses in the immediate aftermath of the crime and heard directly from them in a time of great trepidation and hesitation. All are gone now. But the good news is that a handful of their replacements came right behind them in the 70s and the 80s and then the 90s. There are a few of them left. Congressman Luna had the great sense to showcase several of them at the most recent task force hearing. One of them is a man named Doug Horne. Mr. Horne's booming baritone voice and his command of the case should be enough. But what puts Doug Horne in even more rarefied air is the official position he held at the Assassination Records Review Board in the late 1990s and just what he did with it. The ARRB was not technically an investigative endeavor. No, not at all. Yet, thanks to Mr. Horne's more than courageous and honest efforts, the ARRB may have advanced our knowledge of the autopsy more than any other government stab at it. No pun intended. And they certainly did more than the Warren Commission or the bewildering work of the HSCA. I can truly say to you that Doug Horne is an American hero. I mean it. We would not know what we know about the president's autopsy today without the courage he displayed, without the extraordinary drive to get to the truth, without the steely and determined way that he skillfully deployed the ARRB's limited mission into something more. And that something more was to achieve an advancement of the investigation, particularly surrounding the autopsy and the medical evidence. It was literally almost 200 episodes ago, but for those of you who listen to my autopsy episodes on JFK The Enduring Secret, you know much of the Doug Horne story already. Today, we are honored to have Doug Horne here to talk about his recent testimony, his proclamations that have already gone around the world, and hopefully to hear more as he goes beyond what he said at the hearing. For those of you who have not seen or heard the entire testimony of Doug Horne at the Congressional Committee, I would urge you to do so. It's available on the web, and we'll leave a link in the show notes as well. But just to make it a little bit easier, if you haven't listened already, I've summarized those points at the rear of this video. Doug Horne served on the staff of the President John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Review Board, or ARRB, for the final 3 years of its 4-year lifespan, specifically from August of 1995 through September of 1998. He was initially hired as a senior analyst on the military records team. In early 1997, he was promoted to head that very same team, serving as chief analyst for military records until the ARRB concluded its work on September 30th, 1998. During his tenure, he was responsible for securing the declassification and public release of military records related to Cuba and Vietnam policy. He worked extensively in the medical evidence arena and served as the ARRB's point man on issues related to the Zapruder film, the film of President Kennedy's assassination. Doug also served as the principal research assistant to the ARRB's General Counsel, Jeremy Gunn, in preparation for and conducting 10 depositions of participants and witnesses to JFK's autopsy. He was present at all 10 of those depositions. Doug later authored a 5-volume memoir titled Inside the Assassination Records Review Board, detailing his personal conclusions regarding the medical evidence and how the ARRB's work enhanced understanding of the assassination. He maintains a YouTube channel at Douglas Horne, JFK Assassination, and that channel features detailed presentations on his conclusions regarding the JFK medical evidence and how President Kennedy was killed. The ARRB was allowed to conduct depositions even though it was not empowered to reinvestigate the assassination or generate conclusions or findings of fact. The board chose to attempt to, and I quote, clarify the record of certain aspects of the assassination, which allowed it to conduct such depositions. This aim led them to taking depositions from 10 individuals involved in or present at President John F. Kennedy's autopsy, and later an additional joint deposition of 5 Dallas treating physicians. Doug Horne served as the principal research assistant for these depositions, and he was present at all 10 autopsy-related ones. Doug Horne's conduct while working for the ARRB is nothing short of an act of courage. He took actions to learn more in the face of stiff resistance. The ARRB was not empowered to further investigate the JFK assassination, yet it was the work of Doug Horne and Jeremy Gunn, the ARRB's General Counsel, who, more than any other persons during that time frame or even before, it was their work that advanced the official understanding of the autopsy and all of its mysteries. And because it was Doug Horne who wrote a 5-volume memoir largely about the medical evidence and the context and significance of the ARRB's depositions, that his work now towers above everyone else's, including that of Jeremy Gunn, who it appears has made a conscious decision not to write about the ARRB's depositions or the JFK medical evidence. It's an honor to have Doug Horne here today on our program and to learn more about what he has begun to tell of this incredible story that is the JFK autopsy and the Zapruder film. We're here today with as distinguished a guest as I could possibly have on the show, Doug Horne. So welcome, Doug. Thank you for being on today.
Thank you, Jeff, and Rick. I know Rick is with us. Thank you, Jeff. It's a great honor to be here, and I am really jazzed about this interview. I'm really excited about it, so let's get going.
Okay, sounds like a plan. And as you mentioned, Rick Russo, my colleague, is on as well. And as always, he is just like he is in every one of these, like a guy from Charlie's Angels. There's Charlie. He's Rick. He's our Rick. He's our Charlie. Doug, we've already introduced you, so I'm not going to reiterate your bona fides. You're really iconic in this whole discussion about the JFK assassination. Doug, the core of your involvement in the Kennedy assassination case is the time you spent at the Assassination Records Review Board, and particularly dealing with the medical evidence related to the autopsy. But your involvement was more expansive than just that, operating also as chief of the group gathering military records. You had such a unique role, and this was such an experience of a lifetime. I think our listeners would be interested in how you came to be employed by the ARRB. I understand you were in Hawaii working prior to that. That's a long way from Washington. How did they find you? How did you find them? Can you tell us that story?
I found them and I beat the door down until they hired me. So here's how it went down.
Okay.
So I was in Washington, D.C. in the Navy Yard for a meeting on the Navy program I was working with. I was working in Hawaii as a Navy civilian on an anti-submarine warfare program. So there was a class of civilian manned tiny surveillance ships, and they towed a hydrophone array deep underwater. I mean, deep. And it was called the Tego ships, and the array was called the Certas array. And I was involved in logistic support for those little ships, which were manned by merchant marine civilians. But the Navy took and used all the data on where the Soviet submarines were. So I was involved in that. I was in a meeting in the Navy Yard, and that happened to coincide. I arranged it with a friend in the Navy Yard. He coincided the timing of the meeting with a JFK conference I wanted to attend, which was the COPA conference, Coalition on Political Assassinations, in 1994. And so after my Navy meeting was over, I went to the COPA conference, and then I flew back to Hawaii. So at the COPA conference on the last day, which I believe was Columbus Day, I think it was October 10th, 94, they had a guest speaker, and it was Jack Thunheim, John R. Thunheim, who was one of the 5 board members for the ARRB. And he had been elected by his peers to be the spokesperson, to be chairman, Jack Thunheim. So he came and spoke to us, and he gave us what I called his standard stump speech on what the JFK Act was and what the review board's job was, namely the enforcement arm of the JFK Act, to make sure agencies did searches and turned documents either directly over to the archives, or if they wanted to redact part of the documents or withhold them in full, turn them over to us for review. So he reviewed all of that boilerplate stuff. And then he was asked the question, are you still hiring staff? And he said, oh, yes, we're still hiring staff. This is October 94. He said, we've only hired a few people. They had hired an administrator that did the payroll and the travel. And they had hired maybe 1 or 2 others. But that was it at that point. And they were in the process of beginning to occupy office space in a federal building, a building that the federal government rented for various agencies. So they had taken over 1 floor of this building on 600 East Street Northwest, and were, like demolishing it and building little offices and cubicles. They were building a SCIF, secure compartmented information facility, And so he said, yes, we're hiring people, but he said there are 2 restrictions. One is that you cannot have worked for either the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or you cannot have worked for the Warren Commission staff. That's written into the act to avoid any apparent or real conflict of interest. So you cannot have worked for the 2 previous investigations, and you cannot be a current federal employee. I heard that and I kind of went, oh, that's too bad. Because I was a current federal employee. I was a civil servant working for the Navy at the time. But he proceeded to talk about their mission, and so, oh yeah, excuse me. They had already hired the executive director, David Marwell, for the executive director for the staff. So it was David Marwell's job to interface between the staff and the 5 board members, because the 5 board members would only meet 1 or 2 days a month generally. And the staff would do all the work and present the board members with summary each month of, you need to make decisions on these groups of records. And then the board members would vote and argue and vote about their decisions. So they only met 1 or 2 days a month for the most part. The staff, like in Washington, does most of the work. And so under the board's guidance. So anyway, David Marwell was there also, I believe. And so they said, we're having our first public hearing tomorrow in Washington at the old National Archives building. The first public hearing will be about what is an assassination record? We have to define what that means. And we're going to define it differently than most of the agencies would. We're going to come up with a much broader definition, and we're going to take testimony from people in the research community, from the scholars among you, about how should we define what is an assassination record. So, but he got my attention when he said we're hiring staff. So I said to myself, I'm going to go to this public hearing tomorrow, the first public hearing, and hear people who turned out to be people like Jim Lassar, John Judge, Dan Alcorn, Cyril Wecht might have been there, but numerous other people. John Newman was there, Peter Dale Scott, people that were heroes of mine or greatly respected. And when I showed up at the public hearing, there was David Marwell, the executive director, who I had seen the day before at COPA. And I handed him my resume, which I had typed overnight in the hotel on a hotel typewriter. How about that for motivation? So he took it. He was very gracious. He was a very gracious man, even though we disagreed on much of the evidence and what it meant. He was a very gracious man, a real gentleman, and he accepted it. And eventually, and I went to the hearing that day, and that was interesting. And so eventually I was recontacted by the staff of the review board, and they said, well, we need you to submit a resume on a government form, on a federal form. So I had to submit it again in a different format. So I did that. And then I underwent a gauntlet of interviews on the phone, long distance, phone calls from Washington to Hawaii. I think there were 5 of them. There were at least 4, probably 5 interviews. And they weren't on top of each other. There would be one, and there would be another one 2 weeks later, and another one 3 weeks later, and another one 4 days later, and it went like that. And then there was a big delay, and nothing happened. So I called Jeremy Gunn, who had been one of the people who had interviewed me. And at the time he interviewed me, he was the head of research and analysis. He was not the general counsel yet. He later became double-headed, and he had both jobs. He was the head of research and analysis. And I said, Mr. Gunn, is there a problem? And he said, well, yes, there is a problem right now with whether or not to hire you. And but I think it's going to be resolved soon. So because I think it'll be interesting to your audience, what was resolved was that one of the people that interviewed me was the general counsel, Cheryl Walters. I think that was her name. And she didn't want to hire me. In fact, one of the board members was quoted later, Anna Nelson of American University, as saying, don't hire him. He'll try to solve the case. That was the quote I was given by people who heard her say it. And that, sadly, that represented an attitude among all 5 board members. So after I got hired, Jeremy Gunn told me 3 times, none of the board members believe there was a conspiracy to kill John F. Kennedy. They want to release all the records they can. They believe in transparency. They believe in openness. They believe in enhancing the historical record. None of them believe there was a conspiracy. He just warned me about that and told me to be aware of that when I had conversations among the rest of the staff and in the hallway. So anyway, Cheryl Walters was engaged in a power struggle with Jeremy, and she ended up resigning. And then Jeremy Gunn took over her job as general counsel, in addition to being head of research and analysis. He was a very brilliant, very smart, hardworking guy, not real approachable. I found him a little bit cold and intimidating, but because his CV was much longer than mine. But he was a brilliant guy, and he ended up being allowed to hire me. So that's the long answer to your story. How did I get to work for them? And then I was thrown the ultimate challenge after he made the hiring offer, which was in March of 1995. He said, we can't pay for a move. and we can't pay for your plane ticket. You're going to have to get here on your own. I was stunned by that. And I thought, so that's how the game is going to be played. So you're going to finally give me a job offer, but you're not even going to fly me there. And you're not going to pay for even a small move of a small amount of household goods, because I was leaving my family behind. That was very stressful for me to leave my wife and my stepson behind in Hawaii for this 2 or 3 year adventure. But I was leaving them behind, and they had to accept it. They didn't like it a lot, but they understood it was my obsession to be a part of this effort. So had to pay my own plane ticket. I had to pay for my small move of a lot of books and a little bit of clothing. And that was a test of my motivation, I think. And was I serious? So I showed up on August 7th, 1995, and I was there until the end, until September 30th, 1998. And Jeremy hired me on the surface. The main reason was I need people on the military records team, and you're someone who was in the Navy, so maybe you can help us with Navy intelligence and with Navy intelligence records. And I told him up front on the phone, I said, I didn't work in Navy intelligence. I was a surface line officer on surface ships. And then I worked overseas in a shore duty assignment in Saudi Arabia. And I worked in Oakland, California in a shore duty assignment, but I was on 3 ships. I wasn't part of Navy intelligence. And he said, well, we need you anyway. You're part of the military culture, and we need you on the military records team. I said, okay. And he said, but during our job interview, Jeremy Gunn and I discussed the uncertainties in the medical evidence quite a bit, and how there were so many conflicts in the record, and that we both really wanted to do all we could to resolve the inconsistencies in the record. Could we resolve any of these evidentiary problems? Because we knew it was a mess. And so he knew that I had the same curiosity he did. And that's the real reason I think he hired me. That was the fig leaf was, we need somebody else on the military records team. The real reason was I shared his curiosity of the medical evidence. And I found out later that the board did not share his curiosity at all with the medical evidence. So, and that's the real reason I think he hired me. That was the fig leaf was, we need somebody else on the military records team. The real reason was I shared his curiosity of the medical evidence, and I found out later that the board did not share his curiosity at all with the medical evidence. So I may be jumping ahead here a little bit on your list of questions, but as it turned out, the board ended up incrementally approving one by one the request that Jeremy Gunn and David Marwell made of them. Hey, can we depose this one person, please? Can we do a deposition? They started out, can we do a deposition of Doctors Humes and Boswell? Well, that was the first request. And the board members said yes. And so Jeremy considered that a great victory. He was really excited about that. And then later it became more, can we find Dr. Fink? We finally found it. Can we depose Dr. Fink? They said yes. These were the 3 pathologists. Yes, you can. And later it included John Stringer, the official photographer. Even though he's not the only photographer, he was the official photographer. And it proceeded like that for about 2 years. And the reason they assented to each individual request was Chairman Stokes, who had been the final chairman of the HSCA in the 1970s, met with the board members during their confirmation process, which I believe was in 1994. They had to be confirmed by the Senate. So he met with them, and he told them that nobody in the country, essentially no one, was satisfied with the work the HSCA did with the medical evidence. He knew that. He knew that nobody was satisfied with the findings of the House Forensic Pathology Panel, the HSCA Forensic Pathology Panel, led by Dr. Bodden. And he said, I think you, the board, should do all you can to clarify the record of the medical evidence, all that you can do to clarify the record. And, the board members knew that we were not empowered by the JFK Records Act to reinvestigate the assassination or to come up with conclusions about what happened or to come up with findings of fact. But the board decided that they were going to let Jeremy Gunn and his staff do medical evidence or medical witness interviews, unsworn interviews of anybody they wanted to, within reason. It was up to Jeremy and David. And they were going to approve a limited number of depositions to try to clarify the record, and that we would deposit those in the JFK records collection without comment or endorsement, positive or negative, because that way we wouldn't be violating our charter to just be gathering records. So we were creating new records in the hopes it would clarify the record of the medical evidence in the autopsy. And it was going to be up to the American people later to decide what all this evidence meant. So that's the answer to your question.
I think it's so important that you get on the record. I think it's one of the most curious things about the ARRB. As researchers and as storytellers like myself, it's always been curious to me how you've been able to advance that particular aspect of the case in ways that the two more formal investigations never were. And you've explained it, which is really important, I think, for the audience to understand.
Thank you. Well, we certainly tried. One way to clarify things is that you don't interview the three pathologists at the same time in the same room. That was the big mistake made by the Warren Commission. And the House committee, they did their big forensic pathology panel in 1977 interview of Humes and Boswell together. That was a mistake. And they did Fink separately later. So we split them up, and it's amazing how many answers were not the same anymore. There were different answers. And so, that was one of the ways we helped to clarify. And then, of course, where people had given incomplete answers to questions in the past or had contradicted themselves in the past, giving one answer to the Warren Commission and a different answer to the HSCA and a different answer to the Journal of the AMA, then, that was grist for our mill. It's like, why did you change your answers? What is the answer to that question? Or in some cases, they were not asked the right questions, or they were not asked the right follow-on questions. So those were the ways that we tried to. We had to really know the territory of the previous investigations. What were they asked? How did they respond? Which questions were not asked for whatever reason, and which answers were inadequate or conflicted what they'd said earlier. So that was how we were able to make some progress, by having a very good knowledge. Jeremy Gunn and I, two people on the staff, that's it, had a very good knowledge of what had gone before. So we knew what to dig into. And then the only limitations on that were that Jeremy Gunn had to remind me at the beginning of the process that this is not an adversarial proceeding. So my first list of questions for Dr. Humes, he didn't use this language, but he took me to the woodshed on that privately. He said, in so many words, he said, this sounds like a Perry Mason episode. He said, we're not doing an adversarial exercise. This is a fact-finding exercise. So these are not adversarial questions. And so we have to be very careful how we ask questions, the tone of the questions and what we ask. And I got with the program. I said, okay, I get it now. I'm not an attorney. I've never done depositions before. I understand what you're saying. And I quickly complied with the rules of the game. So I'm just glad that he made me his number one research assistant. I won't go into it today in any detail, but Rick knows about it. But there was another person who was initially his primary research assistant on the staff, and I was the number two research assistant. The other person got fired from that job, and I was promoted to become the primary research assistant. And so I was at all 10 of the depositions of the autopsy witnesses and participants, and I'm very grateful for that opportunity.
And I think it's notable, Doug, that you dedicated your book to Jeremy.
Yes, it's notable because not only was I acknowledging that, I believe I said this in my dedication, that he's the one that gave me a chance to be involved and to do something about the case, make a contribution. But he and I had a serious falling out the final 9 months that he was there. We disagreed seriously about some issues, and that's what happens when people feel strongly about things. We were very strong allies for about 2 years, and then I wanted to do more and more on the medical evidence, and he was then no longer head of research. He was now the executive director at the end, and He didn't get along with the board. They didn't get along with him. There was a lot of friction there, and he didn't want to push the envelope anymore and really didn't want to do anything else. And so that we had serious frictions over that and over one or two Zapruder film issues. But so we had a falling out at the end. And the comment he made to me at the end was, "You're never satisfied. You always want to do more." I said, "Yes, I always do want to do more because we have a responsibility to pursue this as far as we can. There will never be another investigation of the Kennedy assassination or a body like this that is a quasi investigation. There'll never be another body like this. And so it's our responsibility to do the best we can and to push the envelope as much as we can because there won't be another chance." And so we differed on that at the end, and it created some friction between us. And I wrote about the friction in chapter 9 of my book. I'll just say that and stop there. So I thought, in spite of the friction at the end and the fact that we had a falling out, he deserved my thanks. So I dedicated my book to him. And I thank him today for hiring me and letting me work with him and do what we could to clarify the record.
Which you did. It's a major advancement in the case. Absolutely.
I wrote the 5-volume book. I call it my monster. Because if somebody went into the archives and all they did was pick out one or two of our medical depositions, there were 10 of them of the autopsy witnesses, and there was one at the very end of 5 of the Dallas doctors. So if they picked out one of those 11 depositions and read it all by itself, without having any knowledge of what the Warren Commission said or asked these people, without having any knowledge of the HSCA and their conclusions, they're not going to get the whole picture. And so you couldn't go to the archives today and pull out any medical evidence interview, the unsworn interviews of people like the Knudsen family, people like Tom Robinson of Gawler Funeral Home, people like Dr. Carney. You couldn't pull out those interviews and understand the context of it unless you were well grounded in everything that went before. And the two people on the staff that were uniquely well grounded in what had come before our interviews was Jeremy and I. So that's why I wrote my book. Was I thought I need to give people my personal conclusions about what most of this evidence that we collected means. And even if even if it's determined later that maybe I made one or two mistakes, or maybe I speculated a little bit too much in one or two areas that made other people uncomfortable, I'm going to do my best to present my conclusions of what our 10 autopsy depositions mean and what do all our medical evidence interviews mean within the context of everything that came before. And then people can absorb it all like a sponge and they can take it or leave it regarding my conclusions. But at least they won't be trying to read one deposition transcript out of context. And so that's why I wrote that. And I know there's no index. It's the biggest weakness in the book. And that's what happens when you write continuously on a book for 3.5 years. After thinking about it for 5 or 6 years, you write continuously while you have a full-time job, and you're just totally burned out. And to do an index of each 5 of the 5 volumes would have taken 6 months total. I didn't have anything left in my tank. So my apologies for that, but
I can say unequivocally, there should be no apologies for that book. The 5-volume set, which I bought early on in my journey here on JFK, The Enduring Secret, is an absolute gem. I would recommend that 5-volume set to anyone. If you're a serious researcher, it has to be in your repertoire of books. And I'll just say this, that when we did our autopsy episodes, which I think totaled just about 30 of them, we referenced you comprehensively.
I was seeking clarity. So I didn't start out like an attorney would, summing up a case before a jury by stating the conclusions first and then reminding the jury what the evidence for that was. I started out at the bottom, down in the weeds, and tried to build the foundation. What is the foundation of evidence for the autopsy photographs being missing, many of them missing? What is the foundation for not trusting the x-rays? And build it up from the bottom up, and then try to reach some conclusions at the end of those chapters. So you had to be patient to read my book, and you have to enjoy detail. And if you're the kind of person who wanted everything explained in a book of 250 pages, then my book is not for you. But it is for people who enjoy detail and who wanted the detail of the medical evidence merged with my personal story of my journey to Washington for 3 years.
Yeah, I can honestly say, and I think we're going to get into some of this shortly, but for instance, some of the personal discussions around moments with John Stringer and others really just add color to this to give you a real sense of how things go in real life during an investigation. It's quite a read. And really, it's one of the most wonderful reads that's out there.
Thank you. You know, during an investigation, a quasi-investigation like that we were doing, the only reason I say quasi is we weren't coming up with conclusions or findings of fact. We just deposited these interview records and deposition transcripts in the JFK collection. But it was a quasi reinvestigation of the medical evidence by Jeremy and I, with the consent of the board members and the executive director. And one of the problems and the interesting things about the story, which I reveal over and over in my book, is if you're me assisting the general counsel, he doesn't always ask the questions that I would have asked. You can lobby with him ahead of time, give him your list of proposed questions. He doesn't always ask the questions I would ask. He doesn't always ask the follow-up questions I would ask. And he had reasons for doing that or not doing that. And sometimes I understood later what his reasons were. Sometimes I didn't agree with what his reasons were. So that's part of the drama. And the other drama is you think you know what a witness is going to say because you've studied what he said to the Warren Commission and the House Select Committee. And then they don't always say what you expect them to say.
Yeah.
You get surprises, and then you get these asides, one of which was from Stringer, which is a magnificent quote. And you're really surprised. And then you have to follow that later. Well, what did that mean? So yeah, it was a tremendous journey, very dramatic.
Let's fast forward. You've mentioned this might be the last official investigation of some sort related to the assassination, and I am referring to it as an investigation, but we know what its actual charter was. Fast forward 27 years later, and here we are in 2025, and all of a sudden, there's a wave of interest again, and Congress begins a process.
Sure, I'd be happy to.
How folks in Congress found you and got you involved.
I was
in
aware
testifying
of the
before the task
Luna
force
subcommittee, the task force on the Declassification of Federal Secrets. That's a very long title, and it could cover a lot. And I knew about the Trump executive order to finally release everything. You know, he said that once before, and then he caved into the CIA and decided not to. And so he's issued an executive order, and I wondered if anything would come of it, or if agencies would stonewall again and come up with delays and excuses again, like they had for years and years since 2017. And so then I hear about the fact that I think it's Representative Comer. I think he's the head of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. He had appointed Chairwoman Luna as the chairman of this task force on the declassification of federal secrets, which would be a JFK records probe and perhaps RFK records probe, and perhaps, I'm not sure, perhaps Martin Luther King. I'm actually not sure, but I know it's about JFK and RFK records.
They are actually
Good.
addressing MLK too as well.
Good, very good. So I was interested in that. And I was a little more interested when she made an initial splash in the media by saying that she didn't believe Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone assassin, that she thought there was a second shooter. So I was both encouraged and dismayed by that comment. You know, I was encouraged by the fact that she wasn't buying the lone assassin hypothesis and conclusion of the Warren Commission. I was very encouraged by that. I was dismayed when she said essentially that Oswald had help and that there was a second shooter, because I don't think Oswald shot anybody in Dealey Plaza. There's a lot of evidence now that he probably didn't. He was certainly accused of it, but it doesn't mean that he did shoot anybody in Dealey Plaza. So I was dismayed that she said essentially that Oswald had help and there was a second shooter. So I didn't know whether to take that literally or whether that was just her way of saying, I don't agree with the Warren report. So I chose to take a benign view of that. And well, she's probably just saying that as a simple way to disagree with the Warren report. And I thought, well, she's only in her second term in Congress. So she may not be an expert on the evidence like a lot of the research community is. So I thought, cut her some slack and let's see what happens. So then I was aware of the first hearing on April 1st. Jefferson Morley, Oliver Stone, Jim DiEugenio, and one or two others. I don't remember their names. So I was aware of that. And I had a mixed opinion on how that went. But, you know, and then I wondered, am I going to be called? And nothing happened and nothing happened. And I kind of had despaired of being contacted. And I tried to write an email to her once, and the system won't let you. The first thing you get asked when you try to write an email to a congressman, the software says, where do you live? And if you don't live in their district, or if they're in their district, if they're in the Congress, in the House, you're not allowed to write a message. They won't accept it. So if you write a senator, they're going to ask you, do you live in that state? And if you don't live in that state, you can't write a senator using the software put up by their office. And if it's a congressman, you can't write them a message online if you're not in their district. So I just gave up. I said, if they want to contact me, fine. And nothing happened. And then on Friday, May the 16th. Now remember, this second hearing that Luna held was on Tuesday, May 20th. And I was aware there was going to be another hearing soon. I didn't even know the date of it. So on Friday the 16th, I got called by a gentleman named Tyler Nixon. So Tyler Nixon, I won't go into his political affiliations because I don't want to today. The important thing is he's intensely curious about the Kennedy assassination. His curiosity is genuine. And I met him at a conference in April 2024. And then he attended a conference where I was keynote speaker in November 2024. So I knew him from having met him. He called me on the phone on Friday, May 16th and said, I think I can get you into the hearing on Tuesday. And I said, you do? He said, yeah, I'm trying to set up a conference call between you and the general counsel for investigations. He's the general counsel for investigations on the House Oversight Committee. I said, he is? That's a highfalutin title. And he said, yes. And he said, I'm trying to set that up. So he had some trouble setting that up, but he called me at 10 minutes to 3 later that day and said, it's on. We're going to do the conference call with Mr. Greenberg, and we're going to do it in 10 minutes. He said, can you do this? I said, yes. So at 3 p.m. on Friday, I spoke with Jake Greenberg, the general counsel for investigations for the House Oversight Committee, for the whole Oversight Committee, because the Luna's thing is a subcommittee. And it was essentially a job interview. Okay. So he was very flat affect, no emotion. He didn't talk much. He just said, Tyler's got me on the phone with you. He thinks you should testify. And I'd like to find out in so many words what you have to offer. So I said, I'd be glad to tell you what I would have to offer. He let me speak for 25 minutes, more or less. I thought it was 10 minutes. Tyler said later it was almost half an hour. He let me speak uninterrupted, didn't interrupt me, didn't express any impatience or, oh, I've got to go, I've got another call, or can you hurry it up, you know, or, oh, I don't know about that, Mr. Horne. He didn't interrupt me at all. So I got finished and I said, look, the committee cannot resolve most of the questions that I raise, but the questions I would like to raise is a function of education, to educate the American public that those people who don't believe the Warren Commission report and those people who have doubts about the HSCA conclusions, their doubts and their skepticism is very well warranted. And in other words, I can provide you with the justification for why your committee is holding these hearings. And he says, it sounds like you can. So he just said, well, you know, standard boilerplate. You can't argue with the other witnesses. Witnesses don't all agree with each other, so you can't do that. And, you know, I said, oh, I understand that. I said, I've watched a lot of hearings on TV. And I said, not only that, I would expect very sharp questions from some of the congressmen, like Representative Garcia, the ranking member, gave Jeff Morley a hard time and tried to box him into a corner and get him to agree with the Warren report. And it didn't work because Jeff Morley said 3 times, no, I don't, no, I don't, no, I don't. So, but I expected somebody like Garcia or perhaps others to come after me after my prepared testimony. And so I said, I'm prepared for sharp questioning and I can handle it. I've been around the block a few times. I've given a few interviews. I know the proper demeanor and decorum at a congressional hearing. And I said, where drama may be great for the media, they love drama and they love people shouting at each other or berating the witness. I said, when that happens, everybody loses. It's not really good for the committee or the witness. So I said, I'm not going to engage in any of that. And I can defend my views. So this guy says, I'm going to have to talk to the chairwoman. I said, okay. He called me back an hour later, 1 hour later, and said, you're in. I've just sent you your plane ticket. I said, you're kidding. He said, no, I'm not kidding. So, and I found out they couldn't pay for a hotel, no overnight stay. You're going to have to travel the morning of the hearing and go home late that night. I said, really? Yeah, we can't swing a hotel room, but we can swing the airplane ticket. So I ended up, to make a long story short, I went by bus because I was afraid the airplane might be delayed, mechanical problem, weather delays, air traffic control, snafus. So I ended up going by bus instead to make sure I got there in plenty of time. But the important thing is I said, I would like an invitation, a formal invitation, so I can really believe this was happening. He says, okay, you'll get that tomorrow on Saturday. Well, I didn't get an invitation Saturday and I didn't get an invitation Sunday. So I was becoming a little concerned because I sent Jake Greenberg my written testimony on Saturday. You're supposed to provide your written testimony at least 2 days before a congressional hearing. So I sent him my written testimony Saturday. And I was wondering, is somebody objecting to what I'm going to say? Are they going to strike me from the list and say, oh, we don't want that guy saying this about a federal cover-up? And so to my great surprise, I did not get bumped and kicked off the list. And on Monday morning, I got this letter signed by Congresswoman Luna. It's the formal invitation, which I got Monday morning. And she didn't sign it till Monday morning, which turned out to be my birthday. So it was a great birthday.
Yeah, it sure was.
And the hearing was the very next day. So this came together at the last minute. And I just want to thank Tyler Nixon for helping set it up. And I want to thank some other backers who are Tyler Nixon is affiliated with, whose politics I don't agree with, but that's beside the point. And so they were supporting my appearing also. So, and I want to read to you the title of the hearing in case people aren't familiar with this. Here's the title of the first and second hearings held by this Luna task force. The title of the first hearing on April 1st and on the second hearing on May 20th was as follows, quote, the JFK files assessing over 60 years of the federal government's obstruction, obfuscation, and deception, end quote.
That says it
That's
all.
a whole statement.
Man, that says it all. Doesn't
All
it?
I can say is, you know, most people probably know from my writings that I'm a lifetime Democrat, or at least I used to be. Now I consider myself nonpartisan. But most of my life I was a Democrat. My mother was a Democrat. My father was a Republican. And all I can say is the Democratic Party has not taken care of Jack Kennedy. They have not done nothing to expose the cover-up over the decades or the false conclusions of the Warren Commission and the HSCA Forensic Pathology Panel. And that distresses me. And so it was a little disorienting for me, I have to be honest, that it's a MAGA exercise, you know, chaired by a Republican member of Congress to hold these hearings. And yet they're inviting me to testify. And I just read you the title of the hearing and it's like, wow. So what it teaches me is that the people that want the truth about the Kennedy assassination and the RFK assassination and the Martin Luther King assassination, it's not a partisan issue. All Americans want to know the truth.
Yep.
And everybody deserves to know the truth, regardless of their political party or who they like or don't like in politics. So I agree with Jim Douglas on that. Jim Douglas, the author of JFK and the Unspeakable, has the same attitude I do. It doesn't matter what their party affiliation is. Everybody deserves to know the truth. And if somebody's trying to do something about it, then he supports them in that endeavor. And so do I.
Speaking of that, because obviously you can be in front of a congressional committee, but you've got to get the message out beyond that. My understanding is that there was a media blackout by the major media houses on this second congressional
It's a
hearing.
big deal. And I want to report on it because it tells you that our country has a serious sickness, and it's called deep state or intelligence community manipulation of the mainstream media. I'm going to tell you a true story. So the first hearing on April 1st was covered by C-SPAN on television, and there was some coverage, minor coverage, by the major networks on the evening news. You know, they had to report that it happened, regardless of their spin. But the C-SPAN carried it. And of course, C-SPAN has 3 channels. Everybody should know this. One channel is for the House of Representatives, one is for the Senate, and one is for public hearings. So there were 2 of the 3 C-SPAN channels that should have carried this hearing. Either the one that covers the House or the one that covers public hearings in Congress. And so listen to this. I speak the truth. Not only did NBC not carry the hearings live, CBS did not carry the hearing live. I'm talking about the May 20th hearing, the second hearing. Mm-hmm. CBS did not carry it. NBC did not carry it. ABC did not carry it. But C-SPAN, whose job is to cover the Congress, did not put this second hearing on live television. It's shameful. And I've confirmed that by talking to my friends who were trying to find it that day, and it wasn't on C-SPAN. And I've gone on the C-SPAN website 3 times, and I have looked up Luna Subcommittee, Luna Task Force, put in the formal title of the task force. I've entered it 4 or 5 different ways. And if this had been carried on television by C-SPAN, there should be a link when you Google it. Oh, by the way, I went to the C-SPAN website and then I entered my searches. They have nothing in their search engine on the second hearing on May the 20th. So, and I'm telling you another problem. Even Fox News, which is, pro-MAGA, even Fox News didn't cut into the hearing live until the middle of my testimony. So the people who had already testified were Dr. Don
Curtis, sure.
Dan Hardway, wonderful guy from the HSCA staff who did the work with Lopez about the Mexico City business.
Yeah.
And Judge Tunheim. And I was in the middle of my testimony when they cut in on it, which was, disappointing to say the least. So there was major suppression of the second hearing. And I think I know the reason. The mainstream media and its handlers in determining for them what is taboo in this country and what is not taboo, were told, we don't want any more of those people on national television. We didn't like what we heard during the first hearing. We don't want any more of that. And they took a look at the press release issued on Monday, May 19th, of who were the witnesses going to be. And they said, oh, no, you're not going to televise that. And I think that's the reason why it wasn't on C-SPAN. I mean, it's in their charter, and they didn't do what they were supposed to do. So they saw Dr. Don Curtis, Parkland Hospital, Dan Hardway, HSCA staff, Doug Horne, ARRB staff, and that's all they needed to know. We don't want that televised. So I want to thank right now Forbes Breaking News. Forbes News posted the 10-minute prepared testimony of Dr. Curtis, and it has well over 500,000 views now.
That's spectacular.
Forbes News posted part of the Q&A session of Dr. Curtis, the question and answer session after his prepared testimony, and that has over 1.5 million views. A week later, after they posted Curtis's 10-minute testimony, Forbes Breaking News posted my 10-minute statement, not my Q&A later, which was really interesting, but they posted my 10-minute prepared statement because all we got was 10 minutes each. That's all you get is 10 minutes. They posted my 10 minutes on May 28th, And I'm happy to report, God bless Forbes News, last night it went over 1 million views. Over 1 million views. And, you know, Don Curtis got a week start on me, a head start on me. So I loved his testimony. I loved Dan Hardway's. Of course, I liked my own. And I found Judge Thunheim interesting, what he had to say. So thank God that the media blackout was mainstream television, and it was not, it doesn't include independent news reported through the internet, at least not yet. So I want to thank Forbes News very much.
It's fabulous. And we're going to provide some supplemental materials at the end of this in a supplemental video that will excerpt those portions of the hearings that you've participated in so that folks can go directly to it. I'm sure when you get done with this, you're going to want to see the whole thing if you haven't already. Listen to it in advance of listening or actually watching us today. So it's fabulous stuff. And I have to tell you, if you're an average American who knows about the average amount about this case, your eyes will just bulge. It's an amazing set of facts. And if we can continue to get it out and put it in front of the public in the way that you did it and the way that other witnesses did it, particularly Dan Hardway and Dr. Curtis's testimony was so cogent in terms of telling the story about what the Parkland doctors truly saw, which has been so controversial. And if there has been a great example of obfuscation around facts in this case, that's probably one of the most cogent examples.
Yes, the HSCA forensic pathology panel savaged the Dallas doctors. They should have deposed them in the presence of the autopsy photographs. They didn't. They were cowards, if you want to know the truth. I mean, I consider it a cover-up. That's my conclusion years later. They didn't want the Dallas doctors testifying under oath before the JFK autopsy photos saying, that's not what I saw, that's not what I saw, that's not what I saw. And so they didn't depose them in front of the autopsy photos. And they concluded in their report that the Dallas doctors were all wrong. I mean, this is unforgivable. These are people who have been to medical school and they know the difference between occipital bone and parietal bone and temporal bone. So it was great to hear Dr. Curtis backstop what all of his colleagues in Trauma Room 1. He backstopped everything they put in their treatment notes that day. The best evidence of what they saw is in the treatment notes written that day before there's an official story of what happened during the assassination. So they're published by the Warren Report. They're either published in the middle of the book, it's in the middle of the 888-page book, their treatment notes, and then their testimony, the different members of the Dallas Parkland treating physicians, their testimony is published in different volumes of supporting evidence and hearings. So I was real happy with what he said and his straightforward answers to straight questions. So he did real well.
You know, I think this is a great time to address what is probably the core of that question. Before we get started on more detailed discussions, let's deploy something we've learned through Stephen Covey. Sort of begin with the end in mind, so that we don't get lost in all the details, complex details that are inevitably going to follow. Using the sum total of your work, Doug, at the ARRB and prior investigations as well, and with now what you've come to learn after some 27 years of additional study after the ARRB shut down, tell us very simply how many shots hit the president and where they entered his body and in what direction. There's so much confusion. I would like our listeners to hear very clearly from you just what you've come to conclude on this topic. And of course, the answer to this question alone, before we get into any other details, will determine whether there was one or more shooters involved. Let's start right here with that seminal question.
answer your, and I think it's appropriate we do this up front before we get down in the weeds. So I'm going to answer your question about how many shots and where did they enter his body, from which direction were they fired. And then I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you my overview of what I believe happened at the autopsy and what instructions the doctors were given and my conclusions about the nature of the autopsy and what was it all about. But first, let's talk about the actual wounds. So President Kennedy, I know for a fact, was shot 5 times. And there's some minor evidence that he may have been shot a 6th time, but it doesn't show up in any written reports or in the skull x-rays. So I'm going to say definitely he was shot 5 times. And I'm going to list them off here. Just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And this is without prejudice to what order they occurred in. Okay.
Yeah, and visually show us so that those that are watching the video. Yeah.
So President Kennedy is shot in the back from above and behind somewhere. I'm not going to say what building because I don't know. I have an open mind about that. Different people have different opinions, but he was shot in the back. And if you believe the FBI agents at the autopsy, who were qualified observers, that entrance wound had a downward angle. Actually, a sharply downward angle. So that's one shot, a back shot. President Kennedy was clearly shot in the throat, from the front. So the throat shot came in just to the right of the midline and just below the Adam's apple. So just below the larynx and right about here. And it was actually above that wound, that entrance wound was a puncture going inward. And it was small and round, 3 to 5 millimeters wide, according to Dr. Perry. And it was above the line of his collar on his shirt. So Dr. Carrico revealed that to Harold Weisberg years ago. So it did not go through the shirt collar, regardless of what Spector said. It entered from the front, from somewhere in the front. There are different ideas about where that came from. I'm not going to get into that today. We're not going to go down that rabbit hole because we could talk about it for an hour. And there are 2 likely scenarios of where the shot from the front that entered the throat came from, but it's a frontal shot. So right there, those 2 things, and that was a unanimous opinion by the doctors at Parkland Hospital the day of the assassination, unanimous. And Dr. Perry said that 3 times during the press conference after Kennedy died. He and the head of neurosurgery, Dr. Kemp Clark, held a press conference. The videotapes of that press conference were later confiscated by the Secret Service, and we've never seen them since. But we have a transcript of what they said. So 3 times, the White House transcript from Wayne Hawks, the court reporter in the room, said, Perry said 3 times, the shot that entered his throat was coming at him from the front. He said that 3 times. So that's 2 shots. And right there, that rules out a lone assassin. Right there. It doesn't matter what the name of the lone assassin is or what his location was. That rules out a lone assassin because you've got one from behind and one from the front. So I'm absolutely certain today, after spending many years studying the skull x-rays with the assistance of 2 people that I consider heroes, Dr. David Mantic and Dr. Mike Chesser. They've viewed these x-rays in the archives and the autopsy photographs in the archives many times. And their conclusions coincide with mine. Their conclusions are that Kennedy was hit by 3 headshots. 3. And that the evidence is in the JFK skull x-rays. 1 was a shot from behind, somewhere behind the limousine. And it entered low in the right rear. I hope you can see this. Low in the right rear of JFK's head. Right about here, about an inch to the right. There's a bump in the back of your head called the EOP. My EOP is right about here. So slightly above and about an inch to the right of the EOP. And so that's where the autopsy report says that bullet from behind entered. And if you look at the lateral skull x-rays, you can see two long radial fragments emanating from that point on the skull. They're fractures. Two long fractures can be seen emanating from that point low in the back of the skull. So that supports that the shot really it entered low in the back of the head.
Does that not imply that that was the first headshot since emanating fractures came from there?
To me, that headshot was the first of the three headshots. And yes, I'm contradicting Josiah Thompson in his most recent book. I think his analysis is seriously flawed, and so does Dr. Mantic. Dr. Mantic has written a critique of it. So experts disagree. Researchers disagree about things, but the reason I believe that was the first of the three headshots, I'll give you two reasons that everybody can understand. The first reason is these two fractures in the lateral skull x-ray taken from the side are very long. And there are other skull fractures seen in the skull x-rays that happened later. And when they intersected the long radial fractures, they stopped. That's called Poupé's rule. So Mike Chesser and Dr. Mantic have explained that to me is when you have an existing fracture in a bone, especially cranial bone, and you have another fracture later, it cannot jump the gap between the first fracture. It stops. The fracture that occurs later stops. So you have other fractures in the skull that approach the earlier fractures and they stop. They can't propagate because the other one happened first. And so also that bullet that went in low in the right rear of the skull, that grazed a piece of bone which became known as the Harper fragment. It grazed and left traces of metal on the Harper fragment. And just a few moments later, a few seconds later, maybe 1 or 2 seconds later, I mean, very shortly afterward, other headshots, they blew out the Harper fragment. It was blown out into the air from a frontal shot. And the Harper fragment, which already had metal on it from the bullet that entered from behind, was blown out of Kennedy's head and ended up in the infield grass in Dealey Plaza. The Harper fragment was found the next day by a medical student, Billy Harper. He took it to his uncle, a pathologist, Jack Harper. So 3 pathologists at Methodist Hospital on Saturday, November 23rd, held the fragment in their hands. They held the Harper fragment in their hands, about 2 3/4 inches wide and about 2.5 inches tall. They said, this is occipital bone from the middle of the back of the head. That's where the occipital bone is. It's in the middle of the back of your head. They said, this is occipital bone. The blood is very fresh. It's human bone. And they all agreed it's occipital bone. And that fragment was taken to Washington, D.C. It was photographed by the doctors at Methodist Hospital, thank goodness, next to a ruler for scale. The FBI made even better photographs of it, very sharply in focus. They exist today. And the FBI x-rayed it. And the FBI x-ray of the Harper fragment, which was blown out of Kennedy's head by a frontal shot just a few seconds after that shot from behind, it shows metal in the Harper fragment right here. So that's why I believe the shot from into the rear of the head occurred first among the 3 headshots. That happened first because the evidence that it left in a piece of bone was blown out of the head moments later, and yet it shows evidence of the entry of this bullet. So the 2 other headshots came from the front. And this is the most remarkable part of my testimony, I think, and of the whole story, is that Dr. Michael Chesser is a neurologist. He studies brains, and he's used to looking at skull x-rays in brains, okay? So he's been to the archives 5 times. And I believe 2 of the visits were to the Kennedy Library in Boston, where he studied a JFK skull x-ray taken in 1960 when Jack Kennedy was alive. They call it a dental x-ray, but it's really the entire skull taken from the side. And he's been to the National Archives at College Park 3 times to study the x-rays and the autopsy photos. And so he he has studied the x-rays in the National Archives, and he has definitively determined that he sees entry of 2 frontal headshots. He sees an entry wound in the right temple. I've got headphones on, but it's in the hair just above, about even with the top of the right ear. So it's in the right temple. It's an entry wound. He sees it in the bone. It would have been hidden in the hair and not seen at Parkland. Not seen by almost everybody, although there are a couple of people that say, I thought I saw a right temporal wound. And so he says he can see it in the x-rays, and he's convinced me that it's as plain as the nose on your face. It's easy to spot. And the other entrance wound of a frontal shot, he's identified it conclusively, in my view, and it's an entry wound high in the right forehead, above the corner of JFK's right eye. So that second entrance wound would be what it was up here. And there are people that saw photographs that showed that entrance wound about the size of a dime. And he can see the entrance wound in the right lateral skull x-ray.
Is there any indication on the one that is on the top of his head, somewhat in this position right here, that it was coming more from the front? It seems that the one on the temple would have come more from the side.
But
A plus. You've already gotten your credit for my. So the conclusions of me and David Mantic and Mike Chesser are that the, particularly me and David Mantic, but the conclusions that all three of us have in common are that the entry shot to the right temple came from the grassy knoll. So in other words, the acoustics evidence found on the dictabelt tape by the HSCA was correct. The National Academy of Sciences 10 years later was wrong. They did not really invalidate that evidence. They tried to, but they didn't. It was valid evidence. That shot came from the grassy knoll. It was an oblique shot that entered in the right temple, an oblique shot at about a 45-degree angle from the front. So it was halfway from the front, halfway from the right side, and it blew out the right rear of the head. It caused this massive exit wound seen at Parkland Hospital, which is the size of a human fist, or was the size of a small orange, or whatever you want to call it, the size of a baseball. That's a term that Dr. Crenshaw used. So whether it was the size of a small baseball, a hard ball, or the size of an orange, or the size of a human fist, that right temporal entry wound caused this blowout in the right rear. And the forehead bullet entry wound, the fragment trail does not connect with the entry with, the fragment trail from this goes sharply upward in the skull, sharply upward toward the upper rear of the skull. And that fragment trail does not connect with the blowout seen at Parkland. So that caused a different pattern of damage, which was essentially a head explosion that was nearly vertical. It was slightly straight up and slightly forward. So that shot came from more or less straight ahead. And of course, that involves another complete argument that we won't get into in this program, but what was the position of his head when the forehead bullet was fired?
You're suggesting that it was a shot taken from a lower point and angled up higher.
Versus a high angle,
well,
a high
I'm not
going
suggesting
up.
it, I'm telling you, and the reason I'm telling you is the x-rays tell the story. The fragment trail in the lateral x-rays is undeniable, and it goes sharply upward. And Dr. Humes lied about that. He lied about the fragment trail in the autopsy report, and he said, it was one of the many times he perjured himself under oath. And he said that fragment trail started way down low where the entry wound was back here. And he said that fragment trail went up to the upper right of the head and blew out the upper right of the head. Well, the x-rays reveal that's a complete lie. The fragment trail doesn't begin down low and go up. It begins high and goes upward from there. So he had no explanation for that in his deposition with the review board and got very embarrassed, red in the face, and says, I don't know why I wrote that. Of course, that's an inadequate answer. So there are 5 shots to JFK's body, a back shot, an entry wound in the back. There's an entry wound in the throat from the front. There are 3 headshots, 1 from behind and 2 from the front. So therefore, no lone assassin, regardless of what his name was,
I want you to clarify two things. That was wonderful, and I also think it's very rare that we get the opportunity to talk about the series of shots that actually hit the president and summarize them in the way that you have, in such an intelligent way. The back shot and the single bullet theory aspect of this as well has put the rear shot higher, because it would have needed to have been higher to have penetrated the back and then come through the throat and gone through that spot in the neck at that level. I believe the back shot that you're suggesting is down at T3.
Somewhere in that.
Yes, it's at approximately the third thoracic vertebra. And the reason I say that, it's not because I don't have MD after my name, but I did swim in this sea of medical evidence for many years. And I know that the president's military physician, Dr. George Berkeley, he was a rear admiral in the Navy, president's military physician, wrote a White House death certificate. And it says that the back shot was at the level of T3. And if you look at the holes in the clothing in the National Archives, or look at the photographs, that matches that location as closely as anything could. The hole in the shirt and the hole in the coat appear to completely match the description Dr. Berkeley gave of T3. And of course, the Warren Commission drawings that they published were made by a medical illustrator, Mr. Rydberg, who had not seen the body at the autopsy and had not seen the autopsy photographs. He was drawing what he was told to draw by Doctors Humes and Boswell right before they testified to the Warren Commission. This is an outrageous story. It's not Rydberg's fault. He was doing what he was told. He was an enlisted man in the Navy doing what he was told. He was a medical illustrator, but he didn't see the body or the autopsy photographs. So you can't take the Warren Commission's position of the so-called, quote, neck wound, unquote, which it wasn't, and have any faith in it. It's based on a drawing that has no meaning. It's just the drawing is propaganda. So look, the FBI agents noted in their report, they wrote a report the day after the funeral. JFK's buried on November 25th, on a Monday. They wrote their FD 302 report, their FDI report, of what they witnessed and heard him say at the autopsy the next day on November 26th. So the researchers call it the Seibert O'Neill report. It was Agent James Seibert and Agent Francis O'Neill. Yeah. Jim Seibert, Frank O'Neill. That's the shorthand. So they record what he said, which is that the bullet entered, it went downward at a sharp angle. And this came out of his mouth at the autopsy. So it's an excited oral utterance or an unrehearsed oral utterance. He said at a 45 to 60 degree downward angle. Well, that can't be true because there's no building in Dealey Plaza that's that tall that would cause a 45 to 60 degree downward angle. But the point is, he said it was sharply downward. And they recorded this in their report. And later, when the FBI questioned them in the mid-60s, because researchers like David Lifton and others were writing letters, they said, oh no, our report has nothing about any of our opinions. We were quoting the chief pathologist, period. So he said that. And then, part of the findings, he gave an oral set of conclusions that night. In fact, he had two sets of oral conclusions that night. We can't go down that rabbit hole tonight because it would take up 30 minutes, but he had one set of oral conclusions to the FBI agents who left at about 11 o'clock. The official autopsy was about 8 to 11. Actually, the first incision wasn't until 8:15, according to the FBI, the first incision that they saw. So the first incision they saw was the Y incision, opening up the chest and the abdomen. They saw that happen at 8:15. So they said, okay, this is when the autopsy starts. And it was over at 11. Officially, it was over at 11. So he told, in the presence of the FBI, he said there were only two shots that hit the president, both from behind. One was a headshot that went in low on the right and came out the right front. And Hume said the other one is a shot in the thorax, in the back, which did not exit the body. That's what he told them. That's what they put in their report. The bullet did not exit the body. It went downward at a sharp angle. And he concluded, based on a phone call with Dallas, that That bullet had been fallen out of Kennedy's back in Dallas during external cardiac massage during treatment, and that must be the bullet found on a stretcher in Dallas. So he said that bullet, the back shot, did not exit the body. He never said it came out the neck that night. He made a second set of conclusions 45 minutes later, approximately, changed his 2-shot scenario to a 3-shot scenario, but he still had a back shot in that scenario. He had a back shot that did not exit the body and went downward. So
it's still an odd thing, though, that they would have described it at such a high angle.
Clearly a miscalculation, and it was what you would call a guesstimate, an unscientific guesstimate, which was incorrect. But the point was, it was a downward angle and it did not exit the body. And by the way, there was no evidence at the autopsy that the pleura, the membrane surrounding your lungs, was not punctured. So no bullet violated the pleura and entered the lungs. So that proves that bullet didn't exit the body and didn't puncture the lung. So anyway, Dr. Humes never says that the bullet that entered the back somehow magically transited Kennedy's body and went around his spinal cord without damaging his spinal cord or his cervical vertebra. That it went. He never said it went in his back and somehow went around his cervical vertebrae and came out his throat. He never said that until the final autopsy report. And I'm here to tell your audience one of my major conclusions. I'm jumping ahead, but they need to hear this now. That official autopsy report in the archives today is the third written version of autopsy conclusions, the third written version. The first draft, which was typed and reviewed Saturday, was burned by Dr. Humes. The first signed version of the autopsy report, signed on Sunday, is missing today, but I know what it said. I've reconstructed the contents by studying media reports and official leaks from the pathologist. And only the third version of the autopsy report says the bullet transited from the back and came out the neck. And that report, which is undated, was first seen by an outsider on December 11th, when a Secret Service agent, Elmer Moore, showed it to the Dallas doctors. It was his way of saying to them, not so subtly, that you guys are wrong. There was no entrance wound in the throat. This report says it was an exit wound. And so that was the first time I know of that it was physically shown to anybody, was December 11th. So the problem with this case, and then I want to tell you what my construct is for what's wrong with the autopsy. The problem with this case is that, folks, trust me, I was an analyst. I studied the medical evidence for 3 years on the ARRB staff. There were 4 sets of official conclusions by the autopsy pathologists about how JFK was shot and how he was killed. There were 4 sets of conclusions. And the official autopsy report is only the 4th set of conclusions, and it's only the 3rd written set of conclusions. So why should we have any confidence in it? We shouldn't. So here's what I think happened. And we're going to get into part of this later, the chain of custody problem later with the body. We need to, because Representative Luna wanted to know all about that. It's a big part of my testimony. But look, there's no doubt in my mind that the autopsy of record between 8 o'clock, or if you want to say 8:15, you can, because that was the time of the first incision, according to the FBI. That was the time of the chest incision. The autopsy record was from 8 to 11. And the reason I know that is Dr. Humes testified twice under oath that the autopsy ended at 11 o'clock. So I conclude that's when the FBI left the morgue. They had 2 tiny, minuscule metal fragments from the cranium, which were picked out from behind the forehead. They were in just behind JFK's forehead, and they took them back to the FBI lab. 1 by 3 millimeters, 2 by 7 millimeters, very tiny metal fragments. So they left at 11. And I guess the point I'm making here is that after they left, somebody called Dallas. Dr. Humes himself or somebody else. I think it was Humes. Dr. Perry's first impression, you know, the man who did the tracheostomy in the throat to help Kennedy breathe at Parkland, the one who said 3 times there was an entrance wound in the throat, a shot from the front. Dr. Perry, when he first testified, he says, well, I think the first call to me was on Friday night. And then, of course, Humes always insisted, no, the first time I called you was Saturday morning, but I think it was really Friday night because Dr. Ebersol, the radiologist, remembered to call Friday night to Dallas, from Bethesda to Dallas. And so I think Humes talked to Dr. Perry or to some other doctor in Parkland Friday, right after the FBI agents left, right after they left at 11 o'clock. And he was told that, oh, yes, we know there was an entrance wound in the throat. We know this, and we're not backing off of it because that's what we saw. So he became, I think, very concerned at that point, and it was his mission. I believe he was told, you must report that. If the Dallas doctors aren't going to stop talking about it, you must report that as an exit wound, not an entrance wound. So that's what happened. And Humes' second set of oral conclusions that night was that he turned this thing that the Dallas doctors would not stop talking about, an entrance wound in the throat, he decided to call it an exit. And but he didn't say that night that it was from the back wound. That night he said it was a bullet that came in low in the back of the skull somewhere, not defined very well, low in the back of the skull, and came out here. That's what he said Friday night. So he came up with 2 sets of conclusions. The second set of conclusions acknowledged this for the first time, and it called it an exit wound. So, and then that set of conclusions, 3 shots from behind, is what was in the first draft on Saturday, the first written draft, which was burned on Sunday, because somebody rejected it. Somebody in higher authority said, no, 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 no. We only have 1 rifle in evidence. We have 3 shell casings. You can't have all 3 shots hitting President Kennedy because the shot hit Governor Connolly.
And Doug, tell the audience why the timing of that call is so important. I mean, obviously the difference between understanding that fact prior to completion of the autopsy versus understanding it the following morning.
Well, okay, this. Everything Dr. Humes has done in this case indicates that he was very malleable, and the truth was malleable, and he was willing to come up with any explanation that would satisfy his superiors. And none of them, they all contradicted each other. So when he said this was an exit wound Friday night, he didn't say it came in the back. He said it came in low in the back of the head. So then that means he's saying there's 2 wounds in the back of the head, which is what he was saying Friday night. So later, several days later, he changes it. Oh, okay, this exit wound was caused by the back shot. So that shows how malleable the truth was to him. He wasn't concerned with the truth. He was concerned with what will satisfy his bosses and what can I sell to the power structure in this country to satisfy them. So the problem is Dr. Boswell told the House Select Committee staff in 77 when they first interviewed him that, quote, we had gotten ourselves into Dutch with the Secret Service about the throat wound, end quote. Well, what the hell does that mean? We'd gotten ourselves in trouble with the Secret Service about the throat wound? That's what Boswell said to the Secret Service. So Jeremy Gunn, when Boswell was deposed by the review board, said, did you know there was an exit wound in the throat the night of the autopsy? And Boswell immediately said, yes, we did. So that's not part of the Humes story. The Humes testimony to the Warren Commission is that, oh no, I didn't make that decision until Saturday morning after I talked to Dr. Perry. So these guys are lying 6 ways from Sunday and they can't agree with each other. So Humes always said later that I didn't decide that the back wound connected to the throat wound until I talked to Dr. Perry Saturday morning. But that's a lie. He really talked to Dr. Perry Friday night. And according to Perry, he did. And then people badgered Perry all night long from Bethesda to try to get him to change his recollections, to try to get him to say that it was not an entrance wound in the throat. People bothered him all night long and berated him on the phone from Bethesda. I don't know who they were, but it was a very disturbing.
How do you know that fact?
Dr. Perry told Nurse Audrey Bell that. So we interviewed Nurse Audrey Bell in Texas because the Warren Commission never had and she was the chief operating room nurse, a person with a lot of credibility. So she saw Kennedy's head wound low in the right rear of the head in trauma room 1. And then she had to leave after 4 or 5 minutes, and she had to go to attend to Governor Connolly's surgery. But the point is, she was close to Dr. Perry, and she said to him the next day, on Saturday, the day Dr. Humes called him the second time, she said, "You look like hell." This is the story she told us. She had already told an author, Harry Livingstone, this story, but I wasn't allowed by Jeremy Gunn to mention Harry Livingstone's name. It was hearsay, and he didn't have a lot of trust in some of Livingstone's conclusions, or, so he said, "Well, we're going to interview Audrey Bell. You're not allowed to ask her about that. You cannot ask her leading questions." So I just said to her at the end of her interview, I said, "Do you have any other recollections from that weekend that you want to share with us?" And she said, "Yes, I do." And she said, "I said to Dr. Perry Saturday morning, 'You look like hell. Why is that?' And he says, 'Well, it's because I didn't get any sleep. I was badgered on the phone all night long from people at Bethesda Naval Hospital, and they wanted to change my opinion that Kennedy had an entrance wound in his throat. They wanted me to change it to an exit wound.' And he said they were challenging my integrity. And that's why I didn't get any sleep." So she told us that on audio tape, and now it's recorded. The audio tape's not great, but at least you can hear her saying it. And we took a portable tape recorder with us, the cheapest one the government could buy. That's why the recording isn't great. $35 tape recorder. And so she volunteered that herself without us asking her any leading questions, which was great. So my conclusion is that this is what happened to Dr. Humes and Boswell, the two Navy pathologists in a Navy setting, before Kennedy's body arrived. I conclude, and we'll get into some of the reasons later, but I conclude that they were told the president was killed in a crossfire in Dallas. We already know that from the Secret Service. We know that. The communists killed the president. We know that. We've arrested one of them. We've arrested a communist, and we know the communist did it. He was killed in a crossfire. We can't tell the American people that. This is how I believe they were briefed. Because we'll have World War III. So I believe the World War III cover story that Lyndon Johnson used later to twist the arm of Earl Warren to force him to serve on the Warren Commission as the chair, was used for the first time on Humes and Boswell. And they were told, "You will not report shots from the front. And if you will obliterate evidence of shots from the front. You will obliterate it from the body if you can. And you will only report shots from behind." And I think that's what they were told. And all the evidence, that's the only way all the evidence makes sense if you study the case. So for example, I believe the entire autopsy was a charade, because there's strong chain of evidence custody that President Kennedy's body arrived 20 minutes prior at Bethesda Naval Hospital, 20 minutes prior to the motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base. The motorcade from Andrews Air Force Base was a light gray Navy ambulance. We all saw the Dallas casket loaded onto it on television, and it was a 45-minute trip to drive to Bethesda. So it arrives out front at 6:55. It's in Secret Service reports, it's in the media, but it's in the reports of Clint Hill and Agent Landis. You can take it to the bank. It didn't stop en route. You can take that to the bank. That's what the FBI agents said. They were in the third car. They said, "We didn't stop for anybody." And so that's when it arrived. But the body arrived 20 minutes earlier, according to a report written by a Marine Corps sergeant, Sergeant Roger Boysian. He was in charge of the Marine security detail for the autopsy. I'm not talking about the honor guard. I'm not talking about the pallbearers. I'm talking about Marines from the Marine barracks, from something called the Marine Institute, who live in the Marine barracks. They were sent out there to do security for the autopsy and keep the media away. And he wrote a report the same day the FBI agents did, November 26th, the day after the funeral. And he wrote that. We went out there, reported to Admiral Galloway, the head of the complex. We're providing security for the autopsy. And then he writes, the casket arrived at 1835 hours. 1835 hours is 6:35. He says Kennedy's casket arrived at 6:35 p.m. That's 20 minutes before the motorcade from Andrews. It was even worse than that. The Gray Navy ambulance with a Dallas casket in it sat out front for 12 minutes at least before moving, before it moved and went anywhere. So here's the problem. There's a lot of evidence, reasonably robust evidence, that Kennedy's body was really delivered by helicopter. And that's why it got there much sooner than the motorcade. That's how it could get there 20 minutes earlier than all the cars from Andrews. And so what was happening with Kennedy's body between 6:35 p.m. and 8 o'clock, the approximate start time for the autopsy of record? That's almost 90 minutes. What's happening with his body for 90 minutes? Nothing? I don't think so. So there's a lot of evidence, which I can go into later. I think I'll go into it later when we discuss Chairwoman Luna's question to me. But there's a lot of evidence that many bullet fragments were removed from President Kennedy's body before 8 o'clock. A bullet fragment was removed from his back wound, from the thorax. That many other bullet fragments were removed from his brain. A vial of 10 tiny fragments removed from his brain, and 4 large bullet fragments. More mass than one bullet and less mass than maybe 2 whole bullets. So a bullet from his back is removed. There's evidence for that. Three witnesses, triple attestation. A vial of 10 tiny fragments from his brain. 4 larger bullet fragments for which a corpsman typed a receipt. The agent took the bullet fragments, the receipt, and with him. And none of these things, none of these bullets were entered into the official record. That's the crime here. It's called obstruction of justice at the very least. Or you could call it a national security cover-up if you're Doctors Humes and Boswell and you want to justify the crimes you committed because you didn't have any backbone. If you were them, you'd probably call it a national security cover-up. They told us to do that. We had to sanitize the crime scene. The body was a crime scene. We had to sanitize it because we might have World War III otherwise. We can't tell the American people Kennedy was killed by a crossfire and that the communists killed him in a crossfire. So it's our job, I believe it was their job, to remove all the bullet fragments from his body before the autopsy began. And I believe that's what they did. And I believe that that's why, for example, when you look at the autopsy photographs today, I'm just going to give you 2 examples. Instead of seeing a bullet wound high in the forehead, which you can see the entry wound in the lateral skull X-ray, and there are witnesses. There are 5 witnesses who said, I saw this in photographs, this small entrance wound. Now, those photos never made it into the official record, but they did exist, and there were 5 witnesses to looking at the photo. So the reason you don't see this in the photographs today, this entrance wound, the size of a dime, it's been cut out with a scalpel. There's a big, ugly red incision right up here where somebody cut out the entrance wound from the skin. It's removed. It's been crudely removed, excised. And one of the Dallas doctors who saw the autopsy photographs in 1988, Dr. Peters, said in front of a camera for a documentary in 1988 that, well, that incision that I saw in there on the forehead, that's a man-made incision. And we didn't, and of course he knew they didn't do any surgery on the cranium in Dallas. Nobody did. So he says, oh yeah, that was a man-made incision I'm looking at in that photograph. So when you look at the autopsy photographs today, there's 2 problems. There's 2 ways in which they differ from the basic Parkland Hospital observations of the head wound. The top of the head is missing in the autopsy photographs. They're very disturbing photos. They make you ill, quite frankly, when you look at them the first several times until you become hardened to it a little bit. But the bone is all missing in the top of the head. And Dr. Boswell confirmed that with a sketch he made at the autopsy. Those are in the autopsy photographs. But nobody at Parkland Hospital saw that. Nobody wrote in their treatment notes or testified in 64 that the bone is all missing in the top of the head. Nobody put that in their treatment notes the day of the president's treatment. And the back of the head, everybody probably knows this who's listening, the back of the head in the so-called autopsy photographs, I don't call them autopsy photographs, I call them post-mortem photographs. The back of the head looks completely intact in the back of the head photos. And you don't see the big exit wound that the Parkland doctors universally were called seeing in the right rear of the head. You don't see it at all. And in fact, the entrance wound in the back of the head is 4 inches higher than it was said to be in the autopsy report. So you have an entrance wound that's way too high in the back of the head photos. It's not in the correct location, seen at the autopsy by the 3 prosecutors, and the exit wound isn't present in the photographs. So all this comes together to me to mean that the autopsy is a charade performed in front of a large audience of 30 to 35 people sitting in the bleachers. Bethesda was a teaching hospital. There were either 2 or 3 tiers of bleachers, depending on who you speak to. And the autopsy had way too many people there for the autopsy of record between 8 and 11. And that Humes is performing a charade. The first thing he does that's dishonest is that the brain falls out in his hands after he unwraps the head. Now, is that disturbing? You better believe it is. Because the audience in the morgue did not see Humes take a bone saw and remove the skull cap. They didn't see him saw on the skull and remove the skull cap, and which is what you have to do to remove a brain. So he said he had an excited oral utterance witnessed by Jem Jenkins, Navy corpsman. And Humes said, "My God, the damn thing's fallen out in my hands." Right. I got news for you. If you believe that the brain fell out in his hands just because the head wound was enormous, then I've got a bridge to sell you in the Gobi Desert. Because you have to cut the spinal cord to remove the brain, and you have to cut the optic nerves, and you have to cut some other structures underneath the brain. And so nobody in the large morgue audience, which entered at 8 o'clock, saw Dr. Humes sawing on the skull. And it gets even worse. So Dr. Fink, the Army pathologist, arrives late. He arrives at 8:30. And when he arrives, the lungs are removed, the heart is removed, and the brain is already removed. And Dr. Humes tells him in front of the audience, Dr. Humes says, "Dr. Fink, no sawing of the skull was necessary." Really? Well, guess what? You can't remove a brain unless you remove the skull cap. So even though Kennedy's head, I'm convinced, had fractures all over it, breaks in the bone from the 3 headshots, the top of the head was not missing at Parkland Hospital. And the Dallas doctors have all confirmed that. And so there are 2 witnesses to Humes doing surgery on the skull before 8 o'clock at Bethesda. This is at Bethesda Naval Hospital. I want to make a point here. JFK arrived at Bethesda with the same wounds that were on his body at Parkland when he left Parkland. That's been proven by me in my book. I won't go into the details. It arrived with the same wounds, but it was after the body arrived that bad things began to happen, strange things. So there were 2 witnesses that say Dr. Humes lied to Dr. Fink, and Dr. Humes lied to the Warren Commission when he said, "I never had to perform a craniotomy." A craniotomy is a removal of the top of your skull bone. He said he never had to do that. All he had to do was cut some of the scalp with a scalpel here and there and just take the brain out. Well, that's a lie. And it's a lie because we have 2 witnesses that he did do that. He just did it before 8 o'clock at night, before the audience was admitted to the morgue. So the 2 witnesses are Tom Robinson, a Gawler's Funeral Home mortician, who arrived with the body at 6:35 along with his supervisor. And he had a 50-yard line seat for the whole clandestine procedure before 8 o'clock. He saw everything they were doing. One of the things he saw was removing a bullet fragment from the back, from the thorax. The other thing he saw was the doctors sawed the skull open to get the brain out. Well, that's normally the procedure at an autopsy, except that Humes later denied it and said, I didn't have to do that. That's nonsense. It gets even worse for Humes than that. Ed Reed was one of the X-ray pathologists, X-ray technicians the night of the autopsy, Navy X-ray technician. Ed Reed testified under oath to the review board that at one point I saw Dr. Humes take a scalpel. Now imagine President Kennedy's lying on his back on an examination table. He saw Dr. Humes take a scalpel and make a very long incision in the top of President Kennedy's scalp, all the way across here, left to right. And then he saw Dr. Humes take a circular bone saw and start cutting the bone underneath that incision in the scalp. Saw him bear down and start cutting the cranium open. And then the doctors realized that these two X-ray technicians are sitting in the gallery watching this. And they said, what are you doing here? Get the hell out of here. Go upstairs to the X-ray lab. We'll call you back when we need you. So both Ed Reed identified this specifically as Dr. Humes did the postmortem clandestine surgery. Well, that's what you have to do to get access to the brain to remove all these bullet fragments, to sanitize the crime scene. So he saw who did it. And the end of this story, the final dot I want to connect for you is that we interviewed Tom Robinson, the mortician, in the review board office, and we showed him the bootleg autopsy photographs that you see in books. I had 8 by 10 inch black and white prints. And we showed him the top of the head missing in one of the horrible autopsy photographs. The president's lying on his back, and all the bone is gone from the top of the head, and all you can see is shredded scalp. And Tom Robinson said to Jeremy Gunn and I and others, he said he was upset. He frowned and he said, well, that makes it look like that's what the bullet did. He said, that's not what the bullet did. He said, that's what the doctors did. He said that to us, to Jeremy, to me, to David Marwell, the executive director, and 3 or 4 other people in the room. And at that point, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. And I looked at Jeremy, and his eyes were about as big as saucers. And he looked at me, and that's when I knew this autopsy is fraudulent and it's a sham, the whole thing. So the last part of the sham was, the first part of the sham was saying, hey, this brain just fell out of my hands. Wow. And so the audience was in a state of disbelief, according to Paul O'Connor, one of the other corpsmen. So Jim Jenkins, the second corpsman at the autopsy, it was Jim Jenkins and Paul O'Connor. Jim Jenkins took the brain from Humes, put it upside down in a bucket of formaldehyde. It was his job to infuse the brain with formaldehyde solution to help it harden so it could be, later it could be cut and examined. Sectioned, that's right. So he puts the brain upside down in the bucket, and before he starts to infuse the brain with these tubes full of formaldehyde, he just puts it in the bucket to soak, and he notices that the spinal cord has been cut with a scalpel on both sides. It's been cut on the right side and the left side at different levels, on each side.
But it's been cut. It didn't fall out.
Cut. He said it was not bullet damage. It was cut. And he should know what scalpel damage to the spinal cord looks like, because it was normally the job of Paul O'Connor and Jim Jenkins to remove the brain themselves. It was normally their job. And they didn't do it that night. And they didn't see anybody else do a craniotomy that night. Jenkins is given a brain from President Kennedy's body, preserve this. So after he puts it, and so part of the story is that we asked Dr. Humes under oath, was the brain stem severed by a bullet? And he says, no. Okay. So Jim Jenkins, there's a big container of formaldehyde solution on top of a cabinet. Kennedy's brain is in a bucket of formaldehyde upside down in a sling, a gauze sling. So Jenkins is trying to take 2 tubes full of formaldehyde, gravity feed, gravity drip, and put it in the carotid arteries going in the bottom of the brain. That's a double. Yeah, that's a double preservation technique called perfusion. So soaking is exfusion. That's just putting it in the bucket for a week or two. Insertion of these tubes, insertion of these tubes is called infusion. Injecting and into the arteries in the brain, or what's left of the brain. So you're putting formaldehyde in there two different ways, and it preserves the brain much quicker. And the technique is called perfusion. So anyway, he's trying to inject these needles to inject formaldehyde into the arteries at the bottom of the brain. And Jenkins has said repeatedly, and I saw him do it I saw it do it on a video filmed in Dallas in 2013, that the arteries in Kennedy's brain had already retracted. They were retracting into the circle of Willis, retracting into the brain and shriveling up. So they were already drying up, shriveling up, retracting. And his conclusion, based on seeing the spinal cord cut, remember, Jenkins saw the brain fall out in Hume's hands without seeing a craniotomy performed. And then the excited oral utterance, my God, this damn thing's falling out of my hands. Jenkins then sees scalpel cuts on the spinal cord, which you would expect to see, but he didn't see Hume's do that. He didn't see Hume's cut the spinal cord. And then he sees the arteries already retracting into the brain, and his conclusions in 2013, and since then, are consistent. His conclusions are that the brain was removed earlier that evening. And his conclusions are that the only reason to have removed it earlier that evening would have been to remove bullet fragments. So this is why I say you have a fraudulent autopsy. So not only does Dr. Humes not do a craniotomy, and he lies to Dr. Fink and says, I didn't have to cut the skull cap off. I didn't have to saw in the skull. But Dr. Humes goes through a charade for 2 hours saying, I can't find this bullet in the back. Let's do some more whole body x-rays of the body. This bullet that's complete sophistry. That is a lie. That is a performance in front of a large audience, because he knows the bullet in the back was already removed before 8 o'clock, because there are 3 witnesses to the fact that it happened. So, and none of these bullet fragments removed earlier were entered into the record. So the autopsy is a fraud. It's a charade performed in front of an audience. And so why does Dr. Humes put at the very beginning of the report, 3 shots from above and behind were heard in Dallas before the president was killed? What? So words to that effect. 3 shots from behind were heard. So Jeremy Gunn had a lot of questions about that. Why did you put that in the report? That's normally not in an autopsy report. You just talk about entrance wounds and exit wounds and tissue slides. That's all you talk about. And bullet tracks in the body. That's all you're supposed to talk about. So Humes put this conclusion at the top, implying that there's a lone assassin. So clearly somebody told Humes to put that in the autopsy report. So that implies that they told him to put a lot of other things in the autopsy report, namely that there's only shots from behind. That's all you're going to report. You're not going to report any shots from the front. And by the way, Dr. Humes and Boswell, it's your patriotic duty to do this. You're saving the country from World War III. And they may have to believe that night. I bet you years later, they may not have believed it. They may have believed that they were suckered and used, but they went to their deathbed not admitting that they were suckered and used. But they chose to prefer to be viewed as incompetent by everybody, rather than admit they were part of a cover-up. So they went to their graves with terribly besmirched reputations, and I think, in a sense, they were victims.
Oh, they were, yeah,
of this cover-up. So, so that's been a big digression, but I think it means I don't have to discuss it later when we discuss my questioning by Chairwoman Luna, because she asked me she said, what did you mean in your oral testimony when you said there's a chain of custody interruption in the president's body at Bethesda? And I explained all of this to her in as succinct a way as I could within the time span available. And so it was the 4th question she had for me.
Well, I have a feeling that
I praised her for, I praised her for giving me the time to answer the question.
I have a feeling I have a feeling she's going to watch this. I'm sure she's going to watch your other specials, but I hope she watches this one too, because that was a really comprehensive discussion around the entire evening, and it's good.
Thank you. Thank you. So I've answered your questions on the 5 shots that I know hit President Kennedy for sure.
I have one question.
There's a possibility of a 6th shot. I'll never be sure about it. And I'm going to tell you what the evidence for it is and what the evidence against it is. The evidence for a possible shot to the left temple is that there was a big blood clot in the left temple area. And it was mentioned by Dr. Jenkins, the anesthesiologist, when he was testifying to Arlen Specter. Specter had to go off the record to get him to shut up about it. Then they go back on the record, and then Jenkins mentions it anyway. He says, "Oh, I'm glad you mentioned that to me because I guess it was just a blood clot. I thought it was, an entrance wound that night." So the trouble is, Dr. McClellan, in his treatment notes, they're handwritten. I think he wrote entrance wound of the left temple. It's like, what?
He's brought that up.
He never said that.
I think he has actually seen it. I've seen
it's handwritten treatment note, and he never talked about that in later years, but he wrote it that day. And of course, the third reason is that when the review board deposed the 5 Dallas doctors in one day, which is not the way you're supposed to do it, and they did this deposition the month before we shut down, Dr. Jones, who was involved in all this treatment at the Gurney in Dallas, he said that a Dr. Lito Porto examined the president's body after death and stuck his little finger in an entrance wound in the left temple. So this would be consistent with what McClellan wrote that day, and it's consistent with what Marion Jenkins saw, which was a big blood clot. The trouble is you don't see evidence of that on the skull x-rays. And because you don't see evidence of that on the skull x-rays, I'm skeptical about it, and I'm going to remain probably undecided about it for the rest of my life. Because how likely is it that a doctor was allowed to walk up to a corpse when he was not one of the people treating President Kennedy around the Gurney? He was not one of those group of 6 or 8 people. How likely is it that a guy would walk up later and stick his finger in a head wound? I mean, the trouble is Dr. Jones volunteered this. I mean, he didn't get any prompting from us. And other than that, Dr. Jones was very credible. He talked about an exit wound in the back of the head. He talked about an entrance wound in the throat. So those are 3 indicators. There might have been another wound in the head, but I'm not going to say there was. So I can only say there were 3 head wounds for a certainty, 1 from behind, 2 from the front. Dr. Chesser's proven it to me. And I would invite people now, if you want to learn all about this, go to my YouTube channel, the @ at Douglas Horne, JFK assassination, at Douglas Horne, JFK assassination. So if you go to that YouTube page for me, I encourage you to watch. If you want to hear me talk about the skull x-rays, the 3 headshots, if you want me to hear me talk about what I think is wrong with the autopsy photographs and explain where I think these 3 headshots were fired from in Dealey Plaza, I would encourage you to watch the presentation titled Director's Cut of the JFK Skull X-rays. It's called the Director's Cut of the JFK Skull X-rays. And it's almost 2 hours long. It's very detailed. It's very good, specific. There's a lot of clarity there in what I'm saying. And so that's the one program I would want to direct your attention to look at later when you have time. And you don't have to watch it all in one sitting. You could watch part of it one night and finish it a week later. So that's my last statement about the headshots. Is there might have been another one, but because I don't see it in the x-rays and Mike Chesser doesn't see it in the x-rays, and we have tenuous eyewitness observations, I'm just going to say it's a maybe. And I mean, 5 headshots is all you need to prove conspiracy when 2 of them are from the front and 1 is from behind. So that's that. And by the way, the one from behind, I'm convinced, is from the Daltex building directly behind the limousine as it went down Elm Street. It was not from the book depository. So that's all explained in my YouTube documentary. So thank you.
Thanks, Doug. I have one follow-on question. It's always been curious to me, and perhaps this is something that Dr. Chesser and Dr. Mantic have talked to you about. And perhaps it goes to the type of bullet that's been used. The speculation around particularly the use of a frangible bullet, if it came from the side. If you think about it, and I'm being very simple about this, if you were to get hit somewhere around the right temple and it was coming in at a 90-degree angle to your head, one would presume if it was a fully metal jacketed bullet, it might have a blowout. Over here on this side, it would come straight through your head, but that never happened. And it seems like the discussion about it relates to the idea that the force came out over here on the lower right rear side of the head. So what is the medical explanation of how that occurred?
Yeah, the medical explanation, it's a little nuanced. I don't mind nuance at all. Dr. Kemp Clark at the death press conference with Dr. Perry, this is the afternoon the president died, he called it, the skull wound, a tangential wound, which means that if you take the literal meaning of that word, it means it grazed the outside of a sphere. So if you did plane geometry and a line was laid in contact with a circle, you'd say that that line is tangential to the circle. So he implied that the headshot, where he saw the exit wound in the right rear of the head, there was no doubt about that. But he implied that the headshot was tangential, that it grazed the right side of the head and barely went in, but it sure as hell made a big blowout. Dr. Mantic views it differently. He calls this shot from the grassy knoll an oblique shot. If you want to pick an angle out of the air, roughly 45-degree angle from the right front. So it would depend on where the shooter was standing behind the fence. The stockade fence on the grassy knoll is very long, and there are many locations where shooters were said to have been. And so I look at it as the bullet entering. It did enter just about at the top of the ear, in the hair, inside the hair, and then immediately exit in the right rear of the skull. But I just view it as an oblique angle, not tangential.
Yeah,
and it's a function of partially where the gunman was standing, but partially of maybe the resistance encountered by the skull as soon as it started to enter the skull. Its trajectory must have been altered just a little bit. But the important thing is, for me, is that the trajectory of that exit debris from that temporal shot, the right temporal entrance wound, the trajectory of that exit debris that came out the right rear of the head was to the left rear. So the exit debris went to the left rear, consistent with the so-called head snap in the Zapruder film, consistent with the two motorcycle cops to the left rear of the limousine, officers Hargis and Martin, being splattered with blood and brain tissue to the point where Officer Hargis thought he had been shot himself.
Doctor,
so that exit debris went to the left rear, which is consistent with the shot from the right front to left rear. And so that's consistent with at least the way the cops were hit. And why the exit wound wasn't in the left rear of the head, it must have had something to do with the bullet being slightly diverted when it entered the skull, and possibly where the shooter was standing. That's all.
Well, Dr. Mantic said, so I caught him in the hallway in Pittsburgh at Duquesne when you and I were there a year and a half ago, and asked him about this. And I got an interesting answer, and the reason I'm bringing it up is you just said, when it's the first time I've heard in your articulation now, the idea that the first shot from the rear entered lower right, and that obviously would have compromised that whole area back there. Well, what Dr. Mantic said to me when I asked him this very simple question, why it might not have traversed directly across, is he said, there's more physics involved in this than you think. And what happens is you've got a body of energy inside your brain. And it's actually at that instantaneous moment looking for the easiest exit.
For a weak point. Oh my God. For a weak point. Yes, sir.
And he said that in fact influences where ultimately it exits the head.
Where will the pressure wave exit the body? Yeah, the pressure wave from the bullet builds up and gets bigger, and it's going to exit at the weakest point.
Yeah, and so interestingly enough, for you to suggest that the first shot had actually weakened that area right down there, to have the second or
Oh,
third
yes.
shot come, headshot come from that direction would probably jive right with. It'd be interesting to see what what they might what they have said or might say about that, because it just seems so intuitive that what you
And
just
Dr. Mantic,
described.
and Dr. Mantic is not only an MD, a radiation oncologist, but he has a PhD in physics, so he's qualified to talk about physics. And I want to make clear to the audience that this bullet that entered from behind, low in the skull, this entry wound here, you need to stop thinking Warren Commission. That bullet did not exit the skull. That's my Doug Horne conclusion. I'm very sure that I'm right. I'm very confident. What it did was it's fired from the Daltex building. The car is going down Elm Street. It's basically a straight shot from here toward the right orbit of the eye, the orbit of the right eye. So the orbit of the right eye, if you look at my presentation on YouTube about the JFK skull X-rays, you'll see a massive fracture in the orbit of the right eye of President Kennedy. It's completely broken. So that bullet, if it didn't hit the right orbit, it created a pressure wave that destroyed the right orbit of the eye and crushed the bone behind your nose called the vomer bone. So Dr. Boswell drew a sketch at the autopsy of looking into the cavity in the top of the head. And he says the vomer bone behind the nose was crushed. He says vomer crushed. And he says the globe of the right eye, he means the orbit, fractured. Fracture in globe of right eye. And you can see the massive fracture in the globe of the right eye in the skull X-rays. So I don't think that bullet exited, or Boswell would have written on his diagram, exit wound in the front of the face. But there was no exit wound in the face. Everybody at Parkland said that. Jackie said in her testimony, from the front, there was nothing. So, the bullet up here is hidden by Kennedy's long hair, his bangs, and this is hidden by blood and hair near the ear. So from the front, there was nothing. She didn't see any exit wound in the face. There was no exit wound in the face, according to the Parkland doctors and Dr. Boswell in his sketch. So I asked Dr. Chester, do you think that bullet fired from behind into the skull, the first headshot, do you think that hit the right orbit? And he said, no, he didn't. He thinks that it created a pressure wave that fractured the orbit of the right eye, but it didn't actually hit the right orbit. He says if that bullet had hit the right orbit, it probably would have come out right here. There would have been an exit wound somewhere here. And he says there was no exit wound in the right eye. So he thinks that bullet was spent and stopped, but the pressure wave cracked the orbit of the right eye. And indeed, President Kennedy's right eye was noted to be divergent, looking in the wrong direction and slightly protruding at the autopsy. So that's what happens when a pressure wave cracks the orbit of your eye. And of course, that's one of these 4 large bullet fragments that's recovered from the body before 8 o'clock.
Yeah,
so Dennis David, one more time, Dennis David, the corpsman, says, I held 4 bullet fragments in my hand. The federal agent let me hold them. That wouldn't happen today, would it? The federal agent let me hold them. More mass than 1 bullet, less mass than 2 complete bullets. I typed a receipt for him. He took the receipt, the typewriter ribbon with him, the whole assembly with the ribbon in it, and the fragments. And then they're never introduced into the official record. So, and so if you ask me, well, where's this bullet that entered the body from the front in the throat? Well, that's why Dr. Humes discovered a massive bruise on top of the lung cavity. Not a hole in the lung, not a puncture of the pleura, a massive bruise on top of the pleural dome. After he removes the right lung, he sees a massive bruise right here. He goes to great pains to illuminate it with lights and to take the pictures. And Humes testified to that, and so did the official photographer, John Stringer. They'd never been in the record. Well, I think I know why they're not in the record. I think that bruise is really, it has nothing to do with a transiting bullet from his back. That's nonsense. That bruise is where this bullet stopped. So it goes through the windshield. If you believe there's a hole in the windshield, there certainly was. because the windshield is changed out twice, but there was a through and through hole in the windshield the day of the assassination. The windshield was changed out the first time in Detroit on Monday and changed out again later in the White House garage. So this bullet is slowed down by the windshield. It enters. It tears the 3 of the tracheal rings. It damages the trachea and it's diverted and stops right here, right next door. It stopped right on top of where the lung is. And that's the cause for this massive blood clot. And that has to be one of those 4 bullet fragments or bullets, whatever you want to call them, that Dennis David typed a receipt for. And so they don't want that in the record because they don't want any frontal shots as part of this narrative. So that's not put in the record. This bullet from behind, which probably broke up into 2 or 3 pieces, because it did not exit the face, but it went in the back and then stopped somewhere inside his head. That's what the other 3 fragments probably are. That this bullet from behind is probably Full Metal Jacket and it just broke apart. And so that's probably what those 4 bullet fragments are. So that's, if you're wondering, well, if Horne is so smart about a frontal shot, where did the bullet go? That's where it went. That bullet did not come out the back of JFK. JFK's back. Look, there's only one hole in his back in the autopsy photos. It has an abrasion collar around it. That's a burning of the skin and the blood, a burning of the skin caused by a bullet going in. So there's an abrasion collar around the back wound, and it went downward. And so that's that. So that is not an exit for the throat shot. That is an entrance wound of some shot fired from some building behind the limousine.
On that one, though, Doug, just because they did indicate that it came from a high angle, it probably was from an upper floor.
Higher floor, likely.
Yeah. I would say a high floor of either the county records building or a high floor of the Daltex or even a high floor of the book depository. Yes. Yes.
For those of you who have not seen or heard the entire testimony of Doug Horne at the Congressional Committee, I would urge you to do so. It's available on the web, and we'll leave a link in the show notes as well. But just to make it a little bit easier, if you haven't listened already, I'm going to summarize the problems with the autopsy that were pointed out by Doug Horne in his testimony. First, there were 8 different sets of autopsy photographs known to have been taken that are not in the official collection today and never have been. They include the following. First, an overhead wide shot of JFK's body taken from atop a stepladder. Second, a photograph of a large bruise atop the right lung, taken inside the chest after the lungs were removed. Next, an entrance wound in the lower right of the skull with scalp reflected, taken from the outside. And there's another photograph of that same entrance wound in the lower right portion of the skull, taken from inside the cranium after the brain was removed. There's a photo of the condition of the back of the head after the embalming and reconstruction was completed, and still showing an exit defect that could not be closed. There are negatives missing from a black and white film pack showing metal probes in JFK's body. There are black and white prints showing a large exit defect in the rear of JFK's head. There are other black and white prints and at least one color positive transparency showing a small entry wound high in the forehead above the corner of JFK's right eye. Some autopsy photos in the official collection at the National Archives are in gross disagreement with the head and neck wounds universally observed by treating physicians at Parkland Hospital on November 22, 1963, and recorded in their notes and in their 1964 testimony. At least 2 and possibly 3 JFK skull x-rays exposed at Bethesda Naval Hospital are missing, and they have never been in the official collection. These missing x-rays were purportedly oblique views of the back of the head, shot at an angle which would have clearly imaged the large exit defect in the right rear of the head. The radiologist at JFK's autopsy, Dr. Ebersol, confirmed that 6 skull x-rays were taken, although only 3 are in the archives today. Next, the science of optical densitometry reveals that all 3 surviving skull x-rays are not originals, but rather they are altered copy films. Dr. David Mantic, through 9 visits to the National Archives, uncovered clear evidence of alteration, including hiding the blowout in the right rear of the skull, the blowout that was seen at Parkland Hospital. And how did they do it? They used a white patch on the lateral x-rays and a fake bullet fragment photographically imposed on the anterior-posterior skull x-ray. This fake fragment is impossibly dense. It does not appear on lateral x-rays, and it was not seen on the original x-rays by 2 of the 3 autopsy physicians. And no fragment of that size, that is 6.5 millimeters, was removed from JFK's skull, according to sworn testimony. 2 qualified medical doctors, Dr. David W. Mantic and Dr. Michael Chesser, who accessed the autopsy materials, agree that the extant JFK skull x-rays reveal unambiguous evidence of 2 headshots fired from in front of the president. That's right, fired from in front of the president, and that is contrary to the Warren Commission and HSCA findings. The x-rays actually reveal a total of 3 headshots, 1 from behind and 2 from the front. Dr. Chesser located the 2 frontal entry wounds on the lateral skull x-rays. Next, we'll talk about the Harper fragment. The Harper fragment was a portion of a skull bone, a crucial item of evidence that has been missing since late 1963. If you want to learn more about that, find my episode on it at JFK, The Enduring Secret. Next, there were bullet fragments known to have been removed from President Kennedy's body at Bethesda Naval Hospital that were never placed into the official record, and they are still missing today. Next, the remains of President Kennedy's brain are still missing today. The brain, following its examination, was placed into a stainless steel container in 1963, and that container, along with an original signed autopsy report, was transferred to Senator Robert F. Kennedy in April of 1965. These materials were not among those returned to the U.S. government by RFK on October 31st, 1966. RFK's attorney, Burke Marshall, stated to the HSCA that RFK had made these materials permanently inaccessible. The 14 brain photographs in the National Archives today cannot be and are not photos of John F. Kennedy's brain. They have been impugned by the official photographer at the brain examination and by one of the FBI agents present at JFK's autopsy. A timeline analysis revealed 2 brain exams of different brains, 1 week apart. JFK's brain was autopsied on Monday, November 25, 1963, and a substitute medical school brain was examined on December 2nd, 1963. The photographs of JFK's brain from the November 25th examination never made it into the official record. The photographs in the archives are of the substitute brain and have been disowned by the official photographer, John Stringer, and FBI agent Francis O'Neill, and that's based on their sworn testimony. The substitute brain photos exhibit too much mass and are on the wrong type of film. Furthermore, the extreme damage to the right cerebellum seen at Parkland Hospital is not present in the brain photographs in the archives. In fact, those photographs show no damage to either side of the cerebellum. Next, the chain of custody of President Kennedy's body prior to the start of the autopsy clearly appears to have been broken, casting doubt on the reliability of the official autopsy report. Next, the Navy pathologists arrived at 4 sets of differing conclusions about President Kennedy's wounds and how he died, and they did so within 2 weeks after his death. The official autopsy report in the National Archives represents only the 4th and final set of conclusions, a fact that Doug Horne deems, and I quote, patently unacceptable. The existing deed of gift from the Kennedy family, dated October 29, 1966, sets severe restrictions on who can view the JFK autopsy materials and how they can be used, resulting in their de facto suppression. Doug Horne asserts this deed of gift needs to be re-examined and lifted to allow qualified experts free and unlimited access to definitively resolve questions about the authenticity of that evidence.